Hey, welcome back to the Legacy Project. We are here with Pastor Peter Mortlock, and we are talking about 7 reasons to believe. So he's preached a message on that, and if you haven't seen it, take a look on YouTube, it's there. We're going to talk about it, we're going to ask some questions, have some answers, and just have a good time.
Great.
So before we get into the content of the actual message, you've preached the message here on the shore, you've preached it at Mount Wellington, you've done a message here as part of the Legacy Project. Yeah. What inspired you to write this message, and why are you so excited about it?
Well, I don't know about other people, but some things light my candle, in the sense of, these are just some practical reasons to believe in God. And to me, they're like those explanations, that show this evidence of God. And, the first one, we talked about, a baby, just what a miracle life is. And when people have a baby and hold that baby for the first time, they just know that, it's just such a miracle. Life is such a miracle. People know that deep down. And so really it's just to inspire people, hey, there are good reasons to believe in God. Because life couldn't happen by chance. So, when people stop and pause and think about it, and this is my heart, of course, for the message, is to give people practical reasons to believe in God. And of course, Christianity is not just a head thing, it's got to be a heart thing. Because as I often say, if you talk somebody into something, you can talk them out of it. So it's not just a matter of intellect to try to get people's, but I do want people to start thinking and pause and say, wow, yeah, a baby is a miracle. There has to be more to life than, just what meets the eye.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you talked also about the story about Madeline O'Hare, who was a staunch atheist in the United States, and who was one of the leaders of kicking Bibles out of schools. And her son became a Christian, and she became furious. And there's a line that she said that when her son became a Christian, that she considered him beyond human forgiveness.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Which is unbelievable, which is crazy. And so you have these famous atheists like Madeline O'Hare and Richard Dawkins. And I guess the question is, why do you think people, particularly atheists, choose not to believe in God?
Right.
Like, why are they so staunch on ignoring the evidence and not believing in God?
Well, we do live in a very spiritual world, more spiritual than most people realize. And there is such a thing as an antichrist spirit. And when people, start to blaspheme or turn their back on God, they can be spiritually overtaken by demonic forces and so forth. The Apostle Paul, when he got saved, scales fell from his eyes. And of course, it is true, when you're born again, the penny drops, the light comes on, you can see things you never saw before by revelation. And so, when people sometimes are adamant, it can be an antichrist spirit, but people also choose not to believe. And atheism, to some degree, is a religion. It's not just it's a religion because people are entrenched in it. And it's a belief system. And as I've mentioned, there's nobody intelligent enough on earth to be an atheist because, nobody's explored the universe.
Exactly.
We live in our little tiny, puny little world, really, with our tiny little puny understanding of things. And science is incredible and unfolding all the time, things that really only verify the Bible, verify creation. But people are atheistic because the only alternative is that there's a God, there's a higher being that created all things, and people don't want to be accountable. People don't want to say, hey, I'm going to be accountable to someone one day for my actions. They want to be God themselves, and of course, that's really where it comes down in the garden with Adam. You will be like God, and so people want to be in charge of their own life. They want to, not have somebody tell them what to do, like a little rebellious child. But the thing is like the middle letter of the word sin, I. When people get all wrapped up in themselves, all about me, and so the only alternative to God is that there is no God, right? So. And it's a convenient escape from being accountable to your maker.
Yeah, that's so interesting, eh? And it certainly takes a lot of faith, a lot more faith to be an atheist. I know you've mentioned from the pulpit before saying, like, You know, it's like saying that there is no spider. You know, to prove that there's no spiders in this building, you'd have to take down every wall. You'd have to turn out every stone to prove that there's no spiders. So it takes a lot of faith. And totally, that's so true with accountability as well. I think people, they just don't want to be accountable. They want to live a life of sin. You know, sin is enjoyable, and you don't want to have to give that up.
That's why sin is sin. You know, because it is pleasurable, but it's only pleasurable for the time that you're sinning. You know, either sleeping with someone or getting drunk or whatever. But of course, the reality is that sin is fleeting.
Yes.
And sin passes. And then, of course, we know that when you go down these pathways, it can lead to bondage. It can lead to demonic even strongholds, you know, and so people get overcome by sin. You know, God first spoke to Cain, you know, God said to him, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is to master over you, but you must master over it. And so sin will kill people, destroys people. Sin will always take people further than where they want to go. People think, I'll just have 1 drink, 2 drinks, 3 drinks, you know, and unfortunately some people become alcoholics, and obviously alcohol can cause a lot of problems in a lot of homes, and drugs are the same, and all these things. But, you know, jealousy, envy, not just, you know, sometimes we think sins, you know, we're thinking about, you know, adultery and that, but jealousy and envy, those things eat people up. Doctors will tell you that most health problems stem from those sort of psychological behaviors, and so bitterness, unforgiveness, those sort of things are sin as well. And of course Saul was guilty of that, of those, you know, sins of the spirit.
It's interesting because sin, I've always thought, you know, sin always appears smaller than what it really is.
Right.
You know, and you just mentioned Cain before as well, and we look at the sin like, you know, how he murdered Abel, and we think, wow, what a sin, but it really started with the envy. You know, he was envious of Abel's sacrifice, and like, you know, it says sin crouches at the door, waiting, you know, and you must master over it. And it's kind of like it's like a snake coiled up. You know, it looks small, but it's actually really dangerous.
And I often say sin's a suck. It makes you look old at 40, right? So you can tell people who've been around. You can tell people who've lived a life of sin and debauchery. You know, they get hardened in themselves and so forth. Obviously, it causes a lot of health issues, as I mentioned before, but it causes a lot of relationship issues. You know, when you take sin to its ultimate, and you know, so because people, as I said, it's all about, you know, themselves. They get wrapped up in themselves. You know, alcoholics, they keep hiding stuff around the house, and you know, and drug. I mean, you know, it does. Sin is a slippery slope, and but as I said, for a while, like it's pleasurable. That's, you know, I've been a sinner myself, so I understand why people go and do these things, and you know, they're out for having a good time and an enjoyable time, and you know, and all that. But of course, you know, when you're throwing up in the gutter and waking up with a hangover, it wasn't as good as what I thought it was. But you go and do it again, you know.
That's exactly right. Now, in the message, you talked quite a bit about evolution. You know, Charles Darwin, even himself stating that this is what he think happened. Yet it's amazing how the theory of evolution, it's still a theory, yet it gets taught in schools. You said a great line, which I thought was really good. How ironic it is that a theory lacking any evidence is taught as fact, and an explanation of creation backed up by science is treated as a myth, which is amazing. Do you think this is kind of part of like a spiritual battle? I know you mentioned just before, you know, people that have got the veils over their eyes. And why do you think people are so quick to defend evolution?
Well, again, people are quick to defend evolution because it takes God out of the factor, right? I know some Christians try to debate, and I did once, you know, that, hey, if God wanted to create the world through evolution, that's up to him. He could have done it that way. I obviously don't believe he did it that way. I think the evidence now says that he obviously did speak it into being. The world, when you look at as I said, we've come such a long way since Darwin. Goodness, I mean, Darwin lived in the 1800s, and you know, he did not have, as I said, DNA just proves evolution wrong to start with, and it traces everybody back to one man and one woman. But the thing is that, you know, Darwin didn't understand, you know, species like we do today. He didn't understand that the heavens, and as I said, back in those days, they thought our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, was the entire universe. They didn't understand that when you look up, you can actually see like the Sombrero galaxy and other galaxies up there. And now they say 2 trillion galaxies. So, you know, we've come such a long way. And as I said, back in the 1950s, when I went to school, 60s, I was taught, on the amoeba, the simple cell. That was what they called it, the simple cell. That's what they thought it was a simple cell, the beginning of life, just a blob, really. But now they know that is not simple. It's very, very, very complex. They say that a cell in an atom is as creative as the universe. And so just wrapped up in that little cell or that little atom. And so the amazing thing is that people conveniently say, well, it happened by chance because, again, it takes God out of the equation. But as I've mentioned, science has been in a dilemma since, probably, the 60s, but more so in the 80s and 90s, knowing that, life is way more complex than what they thought it was, and discovering things now that, obviously basically disprove the theory of evolution. And it has always been a theory. There's no evidence of evolution. No evidence, right? No fossils. There's no creatures changing into another creature.
That's exactly right.
Think about that. I mean, I often joke, and I know it sounds terrible, but when fish come to shore, like whales come to shore, people push them back, and I understand why, of course. But hey, they could be coming to shore to grow legs. I mean, that's what they believe evolution happened, right? Well, how crazy is that? So maybe we're hindering evolution. No, I'm just kidding. So all these things. There's not one species changing into another species.
No, well, that's right.
And of course, they say these happened over millions of years. So what, has evolution stopped now? And if it did happen over a million years, there'd still be kind of apes coming into humans and all that kind of stuff. And but because it's a process, did every ape just turn into a human being overnight, and then it stopped, you know? And how come we still got apes, Why didn't they all die and man go? But in any case, I digress enough to say that, the theory of evolution is still taught in schools today as fact, because they don't want to teach about God.
Yeah, which is amazing, eh? And there's got to be something spiritual, obviously, there, totally. That people are just so blinded to take God out of schools and be so just passionate about forcing the Bible out of schools. It's travesty, absolute travesty.
And particularly when the Bible is a very historical book as well, right? I mean, it goes all the way back to Adam, but not only that, it's got the wars in it, and it's been proven the most valuable, one of the most valuable historic books of all time. The period it covers, it is the most valuable historical book. It's got so much history in it as well. And as I said, Jesus Christ is doing a thing on Bible in schools. They teach about Napoleon, they teach about Alexander the Great, they teach about other historical figures, and yet Jesus Christ, our year 2020, I mean, he is a central figure in history, right? Everybody is tied to him because your birthday, your birthday, right? The year you're born. And so the incredible thing is the most historical figure is banned from schools. And there's more evidence that he walked the planet than any other historical figure of his day, right? So, and yet they sideline him, because again, it's it's an anti-God.
It's just incredible, eh? With the amount of archaeological, historical evidence that there is of not just the life of Jesus, but the resurrection of Jesus is astounding. And one of your points as well, one of your 7 reasons was the global spread of Christianity, which I thought was really interesting. I think when you talked also about, that there are over a billion Christians here on earth today, over 70 million martyrs. And I find that interesting, particularly back in the old times, they had people that would literally die for their faith, and you mentioned about Peter's sermon as well, about how he preached his sermon, and when people heard it, they didn't denounce it. They didn't say, you're crazy, or what are you talking about? They were cut to the heart, and they said, how do I get saved? And that's because, people had either seen Jesus themselves, or they've known people that had seen the resurrected Christ, right? And you have martyrs who would die for their faith. And for someone to be so convinced about the life of Jesus to die for it, that's got to speak a lot of truths, right?
True.
I often think to myself, if I had a gun to my head, saying believe Jesus or die, what would happen? But
exactly. Well, you don't know until you're in that situation. Exactly. I do believe there's a grace there, but one of the greatest evidences, if you like, of the resurrection of Christ is a couple of people. James, I'm not talking about the disciple James, I'm talking about James, Jesus' half-brother, right? He was an unbeliever, and he didn't believe in Jesus, right? But it was after Jesus rose from the dead that he became a believer, because Jesus appeared to him, and he actually became the leader of the New Testament church, you know? And so that is one evidence, obviously, of a person who got radically transformed because of the resurrection of Christ.
Exactly.
Another, and there's also Jude, another half-brother that became a Christian. He wrote the book of Jude. But Paul, Saul, he was a persecutor of the church, right? He persecuted the church. He's putting Christians in jail. He is there when they stoned Stephen and so forth. And then he had a vision of the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus, right? Got totally converted and became a Christian. And obviously the Apostle Paul, probably the greatest Christian that ever lived, right? So, I mean, those transformations, absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt. And then not only did Peter on the day of Pentecost say, listen, you guys nailed Jesus to the cross. You know this. You were there. You did it. And he is now risen, which many of you have seen, you know. And they said, well, what must we do to be saved? You know, they were undone, right? Then, but the Apostle Paul also, in Corinthians and so forth, he actually calls them out as well and says, you know, you were here. And many of the witnesses of Christ are alive and with us still today, right? Some had died and some are still there. So he says, go ask them. Go ask those people. You know, like if you're trying to make up a myth, you'd never say, hey.
No, you never would. You never would. And it's amazing when you think about Paul and Saul, you know, and even Peter. You know, Peter denied Jesus 3 times before, you know, becoming what he did with preaching the sermon and things like that, and the disciple that he was. If you were making this stuff up, you wouldn't. You know, if you're writing the Bible, you wouldn't put that stuff in there.
Right.
You know, you wouldn't put that Peter had denied Jesus 3 times because it makes him look bad or whatever. You wouldn't put, you know, Paul would be perfect from the beginning. But of course, we know that he was far from that, right?
Well, the amazing thing is the Bible shows every man's faults. You know, Abraham, I mean, you know, he lied about Sarah's being his full sister, and also, and David, of course, is well known, and you know, Jonah, he took off from God. And so, you know, the Bible's a very raw book from the point of view, it doesn't paint people in a pure light, you know. And so it's true. And of course, you know, there's so many things in the Bible that if you're trying to make it up, one of the biggest things is that you would not have a woman testifying that she saw Christ first because of where women were in those days. You would never, ever, because, you know, just because of the culture of the day.
Oh, that's so true. I mean, obviously, that's in relation to Mary Magdalene being the first to see the resurrected Christ.
And we don't really, to be honest, understand the significance of that fact in our world today. I know there can still be racism, sexism in the world, but back then it was entirely different, as you can appreciate. And, you know, women were not believed and were not, you'd never put one up on a pedestal as particularly for something of that magnitude. And yet Jesus, of course, revealed himself first to Mary Magdalene. It's pretty incredible.
Okay, just to wrap us up.
And not only that, Mary Magdalene, she wasn't necessarily an honourable woman, and of course there's a huge myth that she was a prostitute. The Bible doesn't say she was, that's one of the myths, but she did have 7 demons cast out of her, right? So she obviously had a few issues, like many people, like we all do. She had some demons cast out, so obviously, you know, so you got this woman who was obviously way down in society to start with, being a woman, and then also a demonized woman. So I don't know what kind of life she's living, but to put her up as a witness, as the first person to see Christ, I mean, it's like...
Again, if you were making that up, you never would do that. You'd be crazy to do that. Okay, so there was a quote actually from Lee Strobel from the book The Case of Christ, talking about his conversion. And so I wanted to ask a question around this. He says, after personal investigation that spanned more than 600 days, my own verdict in the case of Christ was clear. However, as I sat at my desk, I realized that I needed to make more than an intellectual decision. I needed to make an experimental step. And you talked earlier about how, as amazing as these facts are, as amazing as these reasons are, choosing to follow Christ is a heart decision, not just an intellectual one. So there may be people who are watching this Q&A, you may be watching this now, and you actually don't know Jesus, or you don't believe in God, or you are still wrapping your head around these intellectual decisions, these facts and figures. So how would you encourage them to take a step from the intellectual decision to a heart decision.
Right.
How would
that's a great point, Kane. You know, the amazing thing is when you think about these reasons to believe, and also, of course, the 7 great explanations. You know, God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe, and I go into those details on that session, and you know how God's the best explanation for the moral values of mankind, and all these things that I went into. And so, you know, you can debate, and there are obviously people called apologetic speakers who means you give a defense of. And there's been some brilliant people in history. I mean, Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist of all times, you know, he wrote more about God than more about God than science, right? Solano Laku, you know, the greatest lawyer that's ever lived. I mean, these people are, I'm not even in the same room, right? So these people are clever people, and it is true that you can intellectually believe in God, and as they do, and I do too. Intellectually, I'm totally convinced. You know, I don't have to worry about that. But it does come also down to it. You cannot enter the kingdom of heaven unless you're born again, right? So there's got to be a time where you shift from your head to your heart and open up your heart, you know, to Christ. And you do that, of course, by saying a prayer along the lines of, "Dear Jesus, would you come into my heart? Would you forgive me my sin?" And he's faithful to do that. And when that happens, that's really when you get the revelation and understanding. As you say, you see the light, the penny drops, you know, and all that kind of stuff that people know these terms only too well. And so, yes, it is, you know, but it's great to know that we're not believing in something that is totally irrelevant today, or uneducated today, or, you know, just too unbelievable. You know, like I mentioned a couple of things like the Hindu faith, you know, 320 million gods, and they believe that the earth is sitting on an elephant, and an elephant standing on a turtle, you know. Of course, now, because we've disproved that, they say, well, that's just mythological or whatever, you know. But, you know, the Bible is very clear about the world being a globe. It's hanging in space and revolving. So, you know, sure, it's great to have a belief that is backed up with all the facts as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the main thing, isn't it? At the end of the day, as amazing as and incredible as these facts are, it does take that step of faith to be able to open up your heart and to believe in God, and to, you know, not to believe in Him for what He can do for you or to prove something, but just to believe in Him, you know, and take that step of faith because He's there, right? And because He is. He's the great I Am, right? Well, thank you so much for coming along board the Legacy Project, talking about 7 reasons to believe with Pastor Peter. If you haven't seen the message, it'll be there on YouTube. Take a look, check it out, and we'll see you next time.